Okay, back. The last thing I want to talk about, at least for this recording session today, or it's weird to think about time in this situation. But I want to talk about the one last thing to kind of help situate the crossover between postmodernism and the things they carried, is I want to talk about this notion that, again, it's a postmodern notion very much, this one, and the term is called metafiction, right? Metafiction. So, and Tim O'Brien's work, The Things They Carried, is exactly that. It's a work of metafiction. Metafiction, the basic meaning is it's a fiction about fiction, a story about stories, right? Narratives about narratives, where the act of either creating the narrative or the characteristics of a narrative or in some way, shape, or form are brought to the fore, right? They are, they're kind of like right there. It's like if you've ever seen a movie or a TV show where one of the characters turns and looks straight at the camera and addresses you as audience, right? Which is essentially, for decades in Hollywood movies, was a thing you were absolutely not supposed to do, right? It's called breaking the fourth wall for you theater kids looking at you cocks, right? So it's can be done, but you really weren't supposed to do it, and et cetera, et cetera. You were familiar with one of the great proponents of breaking the fourth wall, a very postmodern playwright, and that would be, of course, Tom Stoppard. Arcadia is exactly that. It's a metafictional postmodernist text, as are so many of his plays, where characters do talk to the audience, or in his great work, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, the voice, so to speak, of whoever's writing the stage directions starts talking to the audience, right? So there are, and of course, what happens in those moments is you begin to realize I'm watching something or reading something that's enjoyable, but now something different is happening. In a way, one of the easy explanations, the quick explanations for what happens, for example, to art in postmodern times in the late 20th century is that painting becomes about painting, for example. And so you look at those paintings, like the ones hanging in my room that look like they were done by squeegee, which some of them were, right? And there's no thing there in abstract art. Instead, what you're looking at is really paint, right? Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, they force you to look at paint. And that's part of what's going on in their work, is this kind of awareness of medium. And Tim O'Brien's the same thing, right? Tim O'Brien has written for us a metafictional text, a text that is absolutely about text. So I am going to hit a few moments in the text and talk about why I think this makes it metafictional real quickly. And I will also reveal at this moment that yet again, Whiteside has been entirely wrong, right? I don't know, call it forgivable. What I have discovered upon my excursion to school is that the edition I have does not have the same pagination as the edition you have. Yay, all those page numbers are all wrong, yay. One more thing to complicate our lives, right? How fun is that? But anyway, I'm just gonna do it. What the heck? You're smart people, you'll figure it out. Chapter number 1, it's really about my page 20. There's a moment where O'Brien is talking about the language that they use. It's a section that begins, for the most part, they carried themselves poised, the kind of dignity, right? And he says, they found jokes to tell. They used a hard vocabulary to contain the terrible softness. Greased, they'd say, off, lit up, zapped while zipping. It wasn't cruelty, just stage presence, because they were actors. When someone died, it wasn't quite dying because in a curious way it seemed scripted, and because they had either their lines mostly memorized, irony mixed with tragedy, or because they called it by other names as if to insist and destroy the reality of death itself. Right? So when the narrator of a work is explaining to you the language that is being used by the characters, and then by extension, of course, by the author himself, to talk about the work and to talk about what's going on, right? Drawing attention to the words themselves, you are starting to wind up in the present. You're in the presence of a metafictional text, right? If he's going to talk to you, if she's going to talk to you about the language that takes place, that is being used, you know, and of course, this little passage here has multiple overtones, multiple sort of, it's not just the only reason it's in there, it's there to help us understand a bit more about characters and characterizations themselves. If you go to if you go to the chapter called Spin, and then look on the page right behind it, right, which is the very end of Love. This is where Jimmy Cross comes to visit the main character, who turns out to be a guy named Tim O'Brien, character named Tim O'Brien, right? And he identifies Tim O'Brien as a writer. And at the very end of that section of Love, Jimmy Cross is getting into his car, and there's a little exchange between them. And he says, the Tim O'Brien character says, at the end, though, as we were walking out to his car, I told him I'd like to write a story about some of this. Jimmy thought it over and then gave me a little smile. Why not? He said. Maybe she'll read it and come begging. There's always hope, right? Right, I said. He got into his car and rolled down the window. Make me out to be a good guy, okay? Brave and handsome, all that stuff. Best platoon leader ever. He hesitated for a second. And do me a favor, don't mention anything about no. I said, I won't. Right? The character is very conscious of that there is such a thing as a war story, and that these war stories have certain ways, certain things, characteristics about them, right? The brave leader, noble, heroic, self-sacrificing, right? The kind of person that inhabits the stories we've all seen. And if you've seen any war movie, right, that was made before the Vietnam War, right? That's exactly the way the men are made out to be, as brave and noble, or they find some sort of bravery and nobility, right? It's the nature of the war story. The Vietnam War changes the stories we tell, right? There's the famous, if you're a real film buff and you got some time on your hands, who knew, right? You could search out the John Wayne classic called The Green Beret, The Green Berets. It's a war movie made in the late 60s, early 70s, set in Vietnam, when John Wayne plays exactly this character, right? The noble, the brave, the heroic, the patriotic Green Beret that saves the day. And it's a standout, like a sore thumb kind of war movie out of the Vietnam War, because virtually no other war movie that comes out of Vietnam tells it that way. Right? There's much more problematic. And so it's this interesting sort of clash. Pick any other war movie, pick Platoon, pick Apocalypse Now, pick Born on the 4th of July, pick any other war movie, right? And they just don't tell it that way. So there's this kind of awareness built into the text that we're reading, a kind of metafiction. There's, of course, the chapter called How to Tell a True War Story, which gets anthologized in this work, Postmodern American Fiction. Whoa, right? Again, the institution says so, so you know it is. Da, 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 da. And it's actually the little section it's in this big anthology of postmodern American fiction is the section titled Fact versus Fiction, right? I mean, so it's what O'Brien's raison d'etre is here in this book. And if you look in the section called How to Tell a True War Story, which a lot of it is about exactly that. What are the characteristics of a war story? What goes into a war story? And there's a little section, it's a short little section, it's kind of standalone paragraph. I'll read it to you. It's like about 2 or 3 pages in. In any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. What seems to happen becomes its own happening and has to be told that way. The angles of vision are skewed. When a booby trap explodes, you close your eyes and duck and float outside yourself. When a guy dies, like Kurt Lemon, you look away and then look back for a moment and then look away again. The pictures get jumbled. You tend to miss a lot. And then afterward, when you go to tell about it, there is always that surreal seemingness. which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents the hard and exact truth as it seemed. Right? So he's talking about that conflation between how things seemed and how those things, the way that they seemed, in turn become what you call then afterwards the truth. But was it actually the way it happened? For those of you that were staying awake in psych class, right, this is exactly what Loftus is talking about in those famous experiments from the 70s about the car crashes, right? More studies were done more recently. There's a great episode in Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast about memory. And in the middle of it, he references they did multiple universities, multiple psychologists did these massive studies because they saw the opportunity after the Twin Towers came down on 9/11. They went out in the next couple of weeks, or immediately after that, and they interviewed people about what they saw happen. What people in New York, what did you see? What was your experience, right? And they recorded it, got it all down, and then they went back 10 years later and tracked those same people down and said, what happened? And the memories, like astoundingly, I can't remember what the number is. I want to say it's like close to 80 to 90% of people, their memories were radically different from what they said immediately following the event, right? And even when confronted with that, they denied the earlier version, the version that they took down immediately following the event. They said, I got that wrong. What's in my memory is true. Right? It's that postmodern recognition. Truth is highly malleable, right? It's so great. It's so wonderful. It's so cool because it means what it means, right? Rather than like depression, right? And this is why I get excited about this and why I have, not one, not two, not three, 4, just 4 books at school, just 4 books here about postmodernism. Right? This was all that we talked about in graduate school at Duke for those 2 years that I was there and the 2 years afterwards that I worked at Duke, talking about, reading, arguing about postmodernism. What postmodernism allows for then, right? If it does away with subjectivity and objectivity, what it allows for is an incredible amount of freedom and liberation of expression. You get to then sort of like engage in making truth. You get to engage in creating the story the way you want it to be and right in a certain way. And then the question is, you get to do that. I don't know. It's liberating. It's fascinating. It gets me excited, which makes, of course, this moment all the harder for me because I really want you in the room here so that we can, because I'm sure you're going to want to argue with me about this, looking at you, Callaway. But here we are, we're doing it this way. So, talk back to me in some way, shape, or form. You're smart people, you're tech savvy, you'll figure it out. So O'Brien is very cognizant. The story he's telling is not, in a certain way, kind of like the ultimate true story, but that there is a kind of truth in it. And he's working with what is institutionally accepted, the ways of storytelling. He talks about them, right? Here's how you tell a story. Now, this is why this is different. He talks about them. And in a certain sense, his book is an argument for a new way of looking at storytelling and truth telling. And it turns out that he's right because it's so universally taught. This book is taught in high schools and colleges out the yin-yang. I mean, it's really just, it's made his career. It's kind of fascinating that way. So that's metafiction. Fiction's about fictions, right? And the book goes on. There's more metafictional stuff in here. There's this chapter called Notes that we'll get to much later, where he talks about, he says, things like, here's the story I told, but then here's what really happened. But again, it's a fictional writer telling you what really happened. So there's all kinds of moments in here. He talks about the style of storytelling. So there's all kinds of moments in here where he's talking about and very much pointing to awareness of that he is telling a story. So that's it. So those are our 3 big takeaways right now. Postmodernism, early quick introduction, really quick introduction. And postmodernist ideas about identity, postmodernist ideas about text, and postmodernist ideas about metafiction. all three of those things should sound in a certain sort of way familiar. You should be able to make connections to the Wallace piece that we talked about, right? The idea about the arguments about dictionaries. You can connect it to the argument over what a wilderness is. And Cronin, I would posit to you that the Cronin article about wilderness is very much a postmodernist argument. That's by design, kids. I thought about it. So let's see, what else have we read? All right, the idea of Africa, right? That piece by Parker. He's talking about and wrestling out the way in which Africa as a continent becomes defined and created. And that's, again, some of that has to do with issues about a postmodernist kind of approach. Certainly the Stanley Fish pieces and the Michael Pollan pieces, though Pollan is not so much interested in postmodernism the way Fish is very much into it. But the idea that socially we construct science, we construct poems, we construct texts, that these things are socially constructed and socially policed. That's, if you got that down, if you can sort of like at least grapple with that idea, you've covered at least 50% of postmodernism. So, want to talk about, not today, not this video, we're going to talk about the John Cage piece, the Kyle Gann piece you read in the TOK Reader. For me, I know that 45 is a nice marker of postmodernism. Is a nice marker coming out of World War II. Is an easy way to sort of give a point, a birthplace, so to speak, to postmodernism. I like something a little bit more positive than World War II. And the Cage performance, the David Tudor performance of the John Cage piece at that venue in 1952 is a really nice sort of, again, a significant milestone and marker for postmodernism. So we'll want to talk about that. Or I'm going to talk about it and you will get to listen to it. Yay, lucky you. So, all right, thanks for listening in, kids. I'm trying my best to keep these relatively short. So I'll just keep posting them. Enjoy yourself, stay safe, social distance.